Disclaimer: this video is intended for mature audiences and the conspiracy theories discussed are not laid down as incontrovertible truths, thus should be thoroughly analyzed with the viewer's intuition. This video is not intended to disrespect the deceased, but merely to discuss the circumstances and conspiracy theories that have been commonly tied to the Chris Benoit tragedy. On June 25, 2007, the world of professional wrestling was rocked when Chris Benoit, his wife Nancy, and his 7-year-old son Daniel were found deceased in their home. It was reported that Chris Benoit himself was the one who committed these atrocious acts on himself and his very own family. As with the internet, people never take anything at face value and are always questioning the commonly told narrative. This is when a multitude of conspiracy theories surrounding Chris Benoit popped up and have stayed strong till this day. These conspiracy theories believe that Chris Benoit did not take the lives of his wife, son, and himself, but instead, the Benoit family were all murdered by another entity, and that other entity was the recently deceased Kevin Sullivan. Today we're going to dive deep into the questions surrounding the case and try to get to the bottom of this deep rabbit hole. This is the Chris Benoit conspiracies.
Okay, police say pro wrestler Chris Benoit struggled with his wife Friday and his 7-year-old son the day after. Bibles were found next to the bodies.
Chris Benoit cut his teeth in the professional wrestling world in Calgary, Alberta, Canada as part of Stampede Wrestling. A graduate of the Hart family dungeon, Benoit also idolized the Dynamite Kid, and the combination of the two began to inform Benoit's wrestling style. He used the Dynamite Kid's diving headbutt, and despite his smaller stature, his hard-hitting technical style quickly caught the audience's attention. After Stampede Wrestling folded in 1989, Benoit traveled to New Japan Pro Wrestling, where he would begin to build his status even further. After a year of diligent training in the New Japan dojo, Benoit began to wrestle as the masked figure, the Pegasus Kid. Benoit was frequently featured against many of the promotion's most popular wrestlers, and his resemblance to another New Japan legend, the Dynamite Kid, quickly endeared him with the fans as well. Japan was also where Benoit would first come across Dean Malenko and Eddie Guerrero. The three amigos, as they came to be known within the promotion, formed a friendship over their mutual love of professional wrestling and their intense, hard-hitting and technically sound styles. Benoit would make his way to America in the 90s, first as part of the roster at ECW. It was there that Benoit would develop his most well-known moniker, the Crippler. Benoit continued to climb in popularity in America when he made the move to WCW in 1995. Benoit was a prominent cruiserweight in WCW, but perhaps his most famous feud within the company was between him and the Taskmaster, Kevin Sullivan, as this feud would shift the trajectory of Benoit's life. Kevin Sullivan was also a booker for WCW at the time. As the leader of the Dungeon of Doom, Sullivan had compiled a large stable of people with bizarre gimmicks. This was a continuation of an evil Satanist gimmick that Sullivan had portrayed throughout the 80s, and part of that gimmick was his valet, the fallen angel, Nancy. Behind the scenes, Nancy and Sullivan were actually married, and Nancy resumed her role as Sullivan's valet, now under the name Woman in WCW. As part of the rivalry between Sullivan and Benoit, Sullivan decided to book an affair between Benoit and Woman. In addition to their on-screen actions, Benoit and Nancy were expected to keep up the act outside the ring in order to sell the angle, holding hands in public and even sharing hotel rooms to convince the public that the affair that they were seeing on screen was real. The performance was so thorough that Benoit worried it would anger his real-life wife, Martina, who he also had 2 children with. He had asked officials at WCW to ensure his wife that everything with Nancy was just for a storyline, but soon, life began to imitate art. Despite both of them being married, the on-screen affair between Nancy and Benoit blossomed into a real-life affair, creating an awkward situation for all involved. Nancy would also accuse Sullivan of abuse, claiming that numerous black eyes and other injuries were from altercations with Sullivan, and after all of those accusations, she went to Benoit for help and comfort. Benoit and Nancy would both receive divorces in 1997, and Sullivan's relationship with Benoit turned contentious. Not only had Benoit taken Sullivan's wife, but Sullivan likely felt some embarrassment from being the one who booked his own divorce. Many of their subsequent matches featured stiff shots exchanged from the two, including one occasion where Benoit ruptured Sullivan's eardrum on a punch. Benoit and Nancy would eventually give birth to their son, Daniel Benoit, in February of 2000, marrying shortly after. Benoit continued to wrestle for WCW into 2000, but he soon became disillusioned with the company. Benoit, along with some of the younger, smaller wrestlers, felt that there was a glass ceiling for them at WCW due to the older wrestlers keeping all of the main event opportunities for themselves. In a last-ditch effort to try and keep him in WCW, Benoit was given the WCW World Heavyweight Championship in early 2000. But even winning the company's top prize could not placate Benoit. Kevin Sullivan had been promoted to head booker, and Benoit, who had already had his reservations about management, refused to work with him and left the company the very next day after winning the title. Benoit, along with a bunch of other cruiserweights, then jumped ship from WCW to WWE. Very quickly, Benoit positioned himself as a breakout star within the WWE. He climbed up the ranks over the years, winning several championships, but perhaps his most significant year in his career was 2004. In this year, Benoit won the Royal Rumble, becoming only the second ever man to win the match from the #1 position. This led Benoit to winning his first and only WWE World Heavyweight Championship at WrestleMania 20, defeating Triple H and Shawn Michaels in a triple threat match. On the same night, Benoit's best friend, Eddie Guerrero, successfully defended his WWE Championship, and after Benoit had won the title, Eddie came out to congratulate him. The show closed with the two best friends, now the two top champions in the company, embracing as confetti fell. Unfortunately, this feel-good moment proved to be one of the last great moments in the lives of either men. On November 13, 2005, Eddie Guerrero was found dead in his hotel room as a result of heart failure. The news rocked the wrestling world, but hit Benoit especially hard. Benoit, who was considered by most to be aloof already, was devastated by the sudden loss of his best friend. Those close to him talked of how inconsolable Benoit was behind closed doors, often sobbing over his fallen friend whenever he was alone. Benoit became even more reclusive around his fellow wrestlers and began to bring that reclusiveness home with him when he was with Nancy. Benoit was always said to have a very devoted family life, with many of the wrestlers praising Benoit's love for his children and his wife Nancy. Nancy, having retired from wrestling in 1997, had taken to managing the household, but despite their outward happiness, all was not well in the Benoit household. With both Chris and Nancy being strong-willed, fights between the two were relatively common, but on one occasion in 2003, Nancy alleged that Chris put his hands on her. The altercation resulted in a restraining order being out on Benoit to keep him from the house, as well as a divorce filing. Nancy cited that the marriage between the two was irrevocably broken, and she said that she had received cruel treatment as part of the filing. Benoit did manage to apologize to Nancy through the help of her sister, and this caused both the divorce filing and the restraining order to be dropped. After his best friend Eddie died, Nancy and Chris's relationship got worse. Nancy was said to be upset at his roid usage and claimed that his personality changed when he was roided up. On top of it all, his fights with Nancy increased as he began to lose more and more control over his emotions. Nancy even suggested that Benoit retire from wrestling to focus on his mental health, as his time on the road was consistently marked by memories of Guerrero's passing. But Benoit continued to throw himself into his work, and by June of 2007, he had been moved to the ECW brand of WWE. Benoit was in a program with CM Punk, where the plan was for him to win the ECW Championship at the upcoming pay-per-view, Vengeance. Benoit, however, wasn't present for the house shows in the weekend prior to the event. He called his friend on the road and Eddie's nephew, Chavo Guerrero, and left a message telling him that Nancy and Daniel was suffering from food poisoning, so that's why he wasn't able to make the shows. Chavo called Benoit back to confirm the message, but noted that Benoit sounded groggy and tired. Chavo then called Benoit again 12 minutes later, concerned by how the phone call ended, but had to leave a message as Benoit didn't pick up. When Benoit did call back a few minutes later, he said that he had been talking with the airlines about changing his flights for the pay-per-view and apologized for sounding stressed with everything going on with his family. He then ended the call by telling Chavo he loved him, which Chavo would later mention he put a particular emphasis on. After more phone calls with various WWE officials reiterating that his wife and child had food poisoning, Benoit told Chavo that he was scheduled to arrive in Houston the following day at 8 a.m. However, that night, Chavo received 5 text messages between 3:51 a.m. and 3:58 a.m. The first few texts were just Benoit's home address, with one text stating, "The dogs are in the enclosed pool area and the back door is open." Chavo then received the exact same text message, this time from Nancy's cell phone. The next morning, after Benoit never arrived at the scheduled flight, Chavo discovered that WWE referee Scott Armstrong had received the same text messages the night before. After no-showing the pay-per-view and still not having heard from Benoit in over 24 hours, Chavo showed the concerning text messages to WWE Vice President of Talent Relations, John Laurinaitis. With still no word from Benoit and now worried by the texts, WWE officials decided to send a wellness check to Benoit's home in Fayetteville, Georgia on the afternoon of June 25th. There, the police found the bodies of Chris, Nancy, and Daniel Benoit, all in different rooms of the house and all dead. They informed the WWE that they had found the bodies and that the home was being ruled a major crime scene. Despite not having the full details other than the home being a crime scene, the WWE made the decision to turn that night's edition of Monday Night Raw into a 3-hour tribute show for Chris Benoit, featuring his greatest moments and testimonials from the heartbroken wrestlers. The next day, reports started to come out from Georgia that the Benoit tragedy was being investigated as a murder, with Chris Benoit being the only suspect. In a rapid pivot, ahead of their Tuesday night Smackdown show, Vince McMahon addressed the allegations and promised that there would be no mention of Chris Benoit on WWE programming going forward. Meanwhile, the police began to report on what they believed the order of events that took place at the Benoit household, and they came up with this. On Friday, the family was having a barbecue, but at some point in the night, an altercation began between Nancy and Chris. As the fight escalated, Chris bound Nancy's limbs with cables and duct tape and gagged her with a balled up tube sock and tape. He then pressed his knee into Nancy's back and strangled her to death with a telephone wire. Nancy's body was found wrapped in a blanket with a Bible laid next to her. The next day, on Saturday, officials say that Benoit gave his 7-year-old son, Daniel, a high dose of Xanax to sedate him. While Daniel was likely unconscious from the medication, Benoit suffocated him, leaving him in his bed and again leaving a Bible. Daniel's throat showed no bruising but did present internal injuries. It was after Daniel's murder that Benoit first called Chavo Guerrero to tell him that Nancy and Daniel had food poisoning. The next day on Sunday, Benoit removed the bar from his lat pull-down machine, wrapped the cord around his neck, and released the weights, thus dying by strangulation. It was reported that Benoit's computer had recent searches about the biblical prophet Elijah raising a boy from the dead, and also about the easiest ways to break one's own neck. However, police reports indicate that there was no damage to Benoit's vertebrae or trachea, suggesting that he did not actually break his neck. Though no note was initially found in the investigation, Benoit's father has since said that Benoit left a handwritten note in his own Bible, saying, "I'm preparing to leave this earth." The public was left scrambling to try and understand the motives and reasons behind the sudden and tragic events. As the media frenzy increased, with the story called The Crippler murdering his family, roids became the primary suspect in what went wrong for Chris Benoit. As Chris was notably undersized, it was said that he had been using roids and human growth hormones since his teen years in order to gain muscle mass. Following Eddie Guerrero's death in 2005, the WWE instituted a new wellness program, and some within the company argued that Benoit couldn't have been abusing roids because it would have popped up during wellness checks. However, particularly in the early days of the program, it was known that there was massive loopholes to allow wrestlers to continue to use performance-enhancing drugs. Nancy's text to Chris indicate as much, saying that everyone knew the wellness program was a farce. The WWE continued to defend themselves against the media outcry over Benoit's alleged roid abuse, specifically arguing that the premeditated nature of placing a Bible by each body shows that the murders were not a case of roid-induced rage. However, once the autopsy reports were released, they showed outrageously high levels of testosterone in Benoit's body at the time of the murders, which indicated roid use. However, neuroscientist and former wrestler Chris Nowinski had a different theory than roid rage for what happened to Chris Benoit. Nowinski had been studying the effects of concussions on the brain, specifically in reference to CTE, and before Benoit had died, he reached out to Nowinski about his research. Benoit was known for taking massive trauma to the head, whether in the form of unprotected steel chair shots or his own diving headbutt maneuver. Chris Benoit even once said that he had lost track of the amount of concussions he suffered in his career. After the murders, Nowinski shared his CTE theories with Benoit's father. Nowinski was then granted access to Benoit's brain, which was tested, and the test revealed that Benoit had so much brain damage that he equated to an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient, and that CTE was present in all 4 lobes of his brain. It was believed that this level of brain trauma could lead to dementia, but also to a change in emotional behavior, and could have been the leading cause behind the Benoit murders. These are, of course, the facts that have been presented to us since that fateful day in 2007, but as is the case with any heinous crime, multiple conspiracy theories have cropped up over the years to try and explain the murders that seem to occur out of nowhere. A big factor that many conspiracy theorists point to is the inconsistencies in the police report and subsequent investigation, as well as odd happenings at the crime scene. Going back to the day of the wellness check, the Fayetteville police who arrived there were initially unable to enter Benoit's home because of his 2 German shepherds that were roaming free in the yard. This was odd for 2 reasons. First, Benoit's cryptic text to Chavo specifically said that his dogs were in the enclosed pool area, but obviously that was no longer the case. Secondly, the police ended up asking Benoit's neighbor, who had a history and good rapport with the dogs, to go in and move them. It was during this request that Benoit's neighbor first encountered the body of Daniel Benoit and alerted the police that something was wrong. But where questions abound with this entire situation is, even though the police didn't know what had happened in the house yet, why would they send an outsider into the home that could have potentially been a crime scene? By entering the home before the police did, Benoit's neighbor could very well have contaminated the crime scene. Another question here is, why would Chris send Chavo a text where his address is if Chavo already knew where Chris lived, considering that Chavo spent the previous weekend at Chris's house? There are other little details within the reports and crime scenes that, when put together, also pose more questions. For example, a knife was found underneath Daniel's bed, but there was no instances of it being used on any of the victims. Fingerprints were never taken at the crime scene or throughout the investigation as well. There were also 10 empty beer cans and an empty bottle of wine found near Chris's body. Despite this, he tested negative for alcohol. The toxicology report confirmed that Chris had hydrocodone, a painkiller, and Xanax, an anti-anxiety drug, in his system. Some conspiracy theorists believe that the drugs found in his system would render him sleepy and unable to fight back potential intruders in his home. Police used the level of decomposition in the bodies to piece together a timeline, and the conclusion was that Nancy died on Friday, Daniel died on Saturday, and Chris died on Sunday. However, some conspiracy theorists have argued that the varying temperatures in the rooms where the murders took place may make decomposition an unreliable indicator. The police reports on where Nancy's body was found also changed a few times. At first, they said that Nancy was found in an upstairs bedroom, then they said that Nancy was found in the basement, and then they changed it back to that she was found in an upstairs bedroom. There's also the troubling belief that the police were not able to recover Benoit or Nancy's cell phones, the same ones where he sent the text to Chavo and Scott Armstrong. There have also been questions surrounding the body of Chris Benoit, which was reported in different positions depending on the officer. One officer said that Benoit was found lying on the floor next to the machine, while another officer said that Benoit was slumped against the machine. Benoit was also allegedly found with a towel around his neck. This has led many conspiracy theorists to wonder why a person who was seeking to take their own life would care about the potential scars on their neck. Chris also placed Bibles next to Nancy and Daniel's bodies, but there was no Bible found next to Chris's body. Conspiracy theorists asked the question, why would he place a Bible beside Nancy and Daniel and not one beside himself if he knew he was going to take his own life? All in all, the investigation into the crime scene was not the cleanest, which has allowed some people to speculate that the police either did not know or could not know all of the possible information about the situation. Another troubling question that conspiracy theorists have come up with is, why would he tie Nancy up in order to murder her? They argue that Benoit was a big and strong guy and that he could have just hit her very hard in order to knock her out cold and then proceed to murder her. The other troubling fact that people cannot seem to get their head around is the motive Benoit would have had for murdering his family. Obviously, there were issues in Chris and Nancy's marriage, as highlighted with their previous marital problems. Even with the potential issues with Nancy though, it doesn't entirely explain why Benoit would want to kill her, much less Daniel. Everyone who has ever spoken about Chris Benoit talked about how much he loved his son, making it all the harder to envision why Benoit would take Daniel's life. It was also revealed that paranoia began to pop up towards the end of Benoit's life, as he developed a fascination with stories of famous people who had family members get kidnapped, and he began to think that somebody was following him, so he began to take alternate routes while driving. These fears led him to taking a life insurance policy on himself, one in which his ex-wife and children were named as beneficiaries. Benoit had also apparently opened a Canadian bank account in his ex-wife's name, which infuriated Nancy. Many conspiracy theorists asked the questions, why would Benoit take such measures? Did he think that he was in trouble? Was he being threatened, and was he trying to ensure that his ex-wife and children would be protected if something were to happen to him? These conspiracies all lead to one man, someone who potentially would have had the motivation to murder Benoit and his family, and especially to ruin Benoit's reputation in the process: Kevin Sullivan. As mentioned earlier, Sullivan and Benoit had a strong dislike for each other following their time in WCW. Even though Benoit would make a point to praise Sullivan for his professional nature in the ring despite their differences, Benoit's abrupt defection from WCW the day after Sullivan became the head booker showed that there was no love lost between the two men. Sullivan also never remarried after losing Nancy to Chris, and some have speculated that he never truly got over the loss of Nancy or the embarrassing way it happened. There is also belief some people have that Sullivan's Satanism was more than just a gimmick he portrayed on television. The quest for revenge and the religious elements in the murder, between the Bibles present at the crime scene and the Google searches on Elijah, would feed into the idea that a Satanist was behind the heinous crimes. Some have also speculated that Benoit's increasing paranoia could have been in response to when Kevin Sullivan said that he would kill him when they were in WCW. The timing of the murders was also oddly coincidental, as it happened 10 years to the day of Nancy's divorce with Sullivan. Rumors and speculation have also fueled many conspiracy theories, whether the origin of these rumors are true or not. One of the most popular of these theories is the infamous Chavo Guererro phone call. Allegedly, Chavo Guererro, while relaying the story of his recollection of the murders in an article with WWE magazine, stated that he took part in a 45-minute phone call with Benoit on the Friday of the murders. Chavo claimed that their phone call had ended when Benoit went to answer a knock at the door, and following an audible scuffle, the phone line went dead. This theory would explain how an outside party entered the home to murder the Benoit family without any sign of forced entry, and has been used to explain why Benoit sounded so off in the subsequent phone calls to Guerrero, including his emphasized "I love you." One of the more intriguing conspiracy theories, however, was how much was known before the story was ever made public. From the very beginning, people wondered how it was possible WWE wasn't aware of the details surrounding Benoit's death before they put on their tribute show. This curiosity was further fueled by William Regal's tribute to Benoit that night on Raw, where many of the wrestlers sobbed and gave their heartfelt tribute honoring Benoit and expressing their love for him. Regal's words were oddly muted. Instead of extolling Benoit as a family man and a beloved friend, Regal spoke only of Benoit's incredible work ethic and ring acumen, to which people found very strange considering the real circumstances. And then there was the infamous Wikipedia edit that was made 14 hours before their bodies were found. On the Monday following the Vengeance pay-per-view that Benoit no-showed, an edit was made on Benoit's Wikipedia page explaining his absence. The edit read, Chris Benoit was replaced by Johnny Nitro for the ECW Championship match at Vengeance, as Benoit was not there due to personal reasons stemming from the death of his wife Nancy. This edit was made around 12:01 AM, but the bodies of Nancy and Daniel and Chris wouldn't be discovered by police until 2:30 PM, over 14 hours after the initial edit. Administrators at Wikipedia at the time of the initial edit pulled down the post and attempted to verify that the claims of Nancy's death had some weight behind them, asking for a specific citation that the editor could reference. There was also a second Wikipedia edit that was reposted by a user using a different IP address. They cited several pro wrestling websites as the basis of their claim. The police involved in the case were made aware of the eerie postings early on in the investigation, but seemed more annoyed by it than anything else. The police chief complained about using vital time and resources to investigate what was, in all likelihood, just a hoax gone wrong, as there was no way anyone could have known what had happened to the Benoits by that point. Making things even more complicated though was the location of the first editor. The first Wikipedia edit mentioning the death of Nancy Benoit came from an IP address based in Stamford, Connecticut, the corporate home of WWE. A few days later, a 19-year-old man by the name of Matthew Greenberg confessed to making the edit, saying that he had read rumors and speculations as to Benoit's absence from the pay-per-view, and that the whole thing was just a terrible coincidence. Stamford police questioned Greenberg about his potential knowledge of the Benoit murder case, and found that Greenberg had made it a habit of vandalizing Wikipedia pages. Ultimately, the police deemed Greenberg to be harmless and let him go, but that's not entirely where the story ends. Author Irvin Muchnick, while researching for his book, Chris and Nancy, decided to take a closer look into the entire Benoit case, but specifically looked to the Wikipedia coincidence. Muchnick questioned the police's investigation into Greenberg, asking if there was more of a connection between Greenberg and the WWE than the 19-year-old led on. One of the Wikipedia articles that Greenberg had spent time cleaning up in the past was Chavo Guerrero's. This has led to speculation as to whether or not Greenberg and Chavo Guerrero had some form of relationship. Considering that Chavo was one of the only two people who received the ominous and troubling text messages from Benoit, the question then became whether or not Chavo could have tipped off Greenberg that something was going on, leading to the infamous Wikipedia post. As for the second edit from a separate IP user, that has been potentially attributed to someone on the WWE's chat room from the night of the event, where again, a number of users speculated that Benoit was absent from the show because his wife had passed away, with one user going as far to call Benoit a murderer. Once again, the user would come out days later to say that the whole thing was one big, horrible coincidence. In the end, conspiracy theories are a way for people to try and cope with and explain what is otherwise unexplainable. The story of a beloved wrestler snapping one day due to a deadly cocktail of stress, grief, drugs and brain damage and murdering his family is just too much for some people to bear, and when there are instances of unanswered questions or strange coincidences, as there are in the Benoit murders, people tend to try and fill in the blanks. We don't truly know what happened inside that house on that fateful weekend, but what we do know is the lasting effects the tragedy had on WWE and professional wrestling as a whole. In the immediate aftermath, Benoit was scrubbed from WWE's history, and even today, though his matches can still be found on the WWE Network and Peacock, there is still no mention of Benoit. The company also shifted from TV-14 to PG the following month as an effort to rehabilitate their public image in a change that would stick with WWE well into the 2020s. After Benoit died, the wellness policy was also ramped up to make sure that wrestlers do not use roids. The tragedy of Chris Benoit also caused stricter concussion protocols being implemented, and elements like unprotected chair shots to the head being eliminated as more information has come out regarding CTE. The Chris Benoit murders is undoubtedly one of the darkest days in wrestling history. Its grisly and shocking nature is why it is still talked about to this day by fans and onlookers alike, and it's also why conspiracy theories about the murders continue to crop up in many wrestling conversations to this day. The WWE may have done everything to erase Chris Benoit from their history, but there is truly no erasing the events of June 25th, 2007. Chris Benoit is certainly one of the most infamous wrestlers turned murderers, but another is Sunny, WWE's original diva. Sunny went from being the most downloaded woman on the internet to being sentenced to 17 years in jail for murder. If you want to see the meteoric rise and tragic downfall of Sunny, click the video on screen now. Thank you for watching the video.